You saw the fireball. Everyone saw the fireball. A brilliant streak of light crossing the sky above Mayon Volcano, captured on camera, shared in seconds, watched by millions who had never heard of Mayon before that moment. The comments filled with alarm. The headlines wrote themselves, "Fireball over Mayon. Is it about to erupt?" And then the story moved on, because the fireball, a meteor unrelated to the volcano, a coincidence of geometry between a rock falling from space and the most perfectly symmetrical volcano on Earth, turned out to be the wrong story. The right story is what was already happening beneath that fireball when it crossed the sky. What has been happening for 141 days, continuously, measurably, documented in daily bulletins that almost nobody reads. The fireball lasted 2 seconds. What is building inside Mayon has been building since before most of you knew this volcano's name, and the fireball is the only reason we are talking about it now. Here is what this video covers. Mayon Volcano in the Philippines entered its current eruption cycle 141 days ago. In those 141 days, PHIVOLCS, the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, has published a daily bulletin on Mayon's activity. 141 daily bulletins, each one containing seismicity counts, SO2 measurements, rockfall data, dome observation reports, and alert level assessments. 141 bulletins, published publicly, available to anyone. And here is the detail that no coverage has assembled into a single picture. Those 141 bulletins, read in sequence, not as individual daily reports, but as a continuous record of a volcanic system evolving, tell a story that no single bulletin captures. The story of a dome that has grown from nothing to a structure whose current volume has now exceeded the dome volume recorded before every significant paroxysmal event in Mayon's documented eruptive history. The story of a lava flow field that has extended further down the southeastern flank than any flow in the current cycle, reaching distances that the 6-kilometer exclusion zone was not originally drawn to account for. The story of an SO2 record that has not declined to the levels associated with a system winding down for 141 consecutive days. The fireball got 2 seconds of global attention. The 141-day record got none. Stay with me. Because the picture those bulletins assemble together is the most important story about Mayon that the fireball accidentally unlocked. On the night the fireball crossed Mayon, the cameras that were positioned to monitor the volcano, the same cameras PHIVOLCS operates continuously to watch the dome, the summit, the upper flanks, captured something crossing the sky above it, bright, fast, trailing. A bolide, a meteor large enough to produce a visible fireball, entering the atmosphere on a trajectory that placed it directly above the volcano in the frame. It had nothing to do with Mayon. The Philippines sits in the intertropical convergence zone, under skies that receive their share of meteoric material. The coincidence of geometry, a falling rock from space crossing the camera field of one of the most watched volcanoes in Southeast Asia, produced footage that the algorithm was designed to circulate, dramatic, unexplained to most viewers, visually extraordinary. The comments asked the right question for the wrong reason. Is Mayon about to erupt? The answer, or the honest, data-supported 141-day answer, is that Mayon has been in continuous eruption for 141 days, that the system driving that eruption has not shown the decline indicators associated with a system approaching its end, and that the structural state of the volcanic system right now, the dome volume, the lava flow extent, the SO2 persistence, has more in common with the pre-paroxysmal state of previous major Mayon eruptions than with a system in late-stage wind down. The fireball was the wrong alarm. The 141-day record is the right one, and almost nobody connected them. The PHIVOLCS daily bulletin for Mayon follows a standard format. Volcanic earthquakes, the count of seismic events detected beneath the volcano. Classified by type. Volcanic earthquakes associated with magma movement. Rockfall earthquakes associated with material falling from the dome and upper flanks. Low-frequency events associated with fluid movement in the hydrothermal and magmatic system. SO2 flux, the daily average of sulfur dioxide emissions measured in tons per day. Pyroclastic density currents, if any occurred, the gullies they traveled, the distances they reached. Dome observation, the current assessed condition of the lava dome at the summit. Alert level. Each of those parameters, tracked across 141 days, tells its own story. In the first month of the eruption, volcanic earthquake counts were in the range of 10 to 30 events per day, typical of an eruption in early phase. By month 3, the daily count had not declined to baseline. It had remained elevated, interspersed with periods of lower frequency events, the fluid movement signal, that indicate the magmatic system is still being actively supplied. 141 days of elevated seismicity, without the sustained decline that characterizes a system running down its initial magma batch. On an erupting volcano, SO2 flux is the exhaust meter. High SO2, magma is actively degassing near the surface. Declining SO2, The eruption is using up its gas-rich magma and transitioning to denser, less volatile material. Mayon's SO2 output across 141 days has not declined to the below 500 tons per day levels that PHIVOLCS associates with significantly reduced magmatic activity. It has remained elevated, fluctuating between higher and lower days, never bottoming out. 141 days of above baseline SO2, 141 days of magma still close enough to the surface to exhale at elevated rates. Day 1 of the current eruption cycle, no dome. The eruption began with the extrusion of fresh lava at the summit. Day 30, a dome is forming, small, low profile, consistent with early phase dome growth. Day 60, the dome has grown. The PHIVOLCS bulletin notes its increasing volume, lava flow activity on the southeastern flank, extending beyond the initial flow field. Day 100, the dome continues to grow. Rockfall activity elevated. Pyroclastic flows generated regularly from dome collapse events. Day 141, today. The dome is at its largest recorded volume in the current eruption cycle, and this is the number that no coverage has calculated from the public data. The accumulated lava volume extruded over 141 days of continuous dome growth and lava flow activity, estimated from PHIVOLCS observation data and eruption rate proxies, is now comparable to the pre-paroxysmal lava volumes recorded in PHIVOLCS documentation of Mayon's 1984 and 2006 eruption cycles, both of which were followed by significant paroxysmal episodes that produced their most hazardous activity after extended dome growth phases. 141 days of dome growth. To understand what that means, you need to understand what a growing lava dome is. It is not a pile of hardened lava. It is a living structure. Hot interior, cooled outer crust, constantly being pushed outward by the magma still extruding from the vent below. As it grows, it does not simply get larger. It becomes structurally more complex. Fractures develop in the cooling outer crust as it is pushed beyond its elastic limit by the expanding interior. Those fractures are the pathways through which the dome eventually fails, producing the rockfall events that PHIVOLCS logs daily, and when the failure is large enough, the pyroclastic density currents that define Mayon's most dangerous moments. A dome that has been growing for 141 days is a dome that has cycled through multiple episodes of fracture, failure, and regrowth. Each cycle leaves the internal structure more complex, more fractured, more heterogeneous. The current dome is not the same dome that was forming in week 1. It is a rebuilt structure, grown, failed partially, regrown over the debris of its failures, more than 4 months old at its outer layers, and continuously fresh at its actively extruding core. The structural complexity of a 141-day dome has specific implications for how it fails. A young, simple dome tends to fail at its margins, producing relatively small, relatively predictable collapse events. An old, complex, heavily fractured dome can fail internally, the fracture network connecting the hot interior to the surface through a pathway that bypasses the cooled outer crust. When that happens, the pressurized hot material inside the dome does not simply collapse outward. It decompresses explosively, outward and upward, producing a pyroclastic flow not from the base of the dome but from its body, carrying material at higher temperature and higher velocity than a gravitational collapse event produces. This is not a prediction. It is a description of a documented failure mode for mature, complex lava domes, the failure mode that characterizes Mayon's most hazardous paroxysmal events. And the dome at Mayon's summit right now is 141 days old. PHIVOLCS operates one of the best equipped volcano monitoring programs in Southeast Asia. The sensor network around Mayon includes a seismic array, stations positioned at multiple elevations and azimuths around the volcano, providing continuous waveform data on volcanic earthquakes, rockfall events, and low-frequency signals. SO2 flux instruments, measuring sulfur dioxide output from the plume on a daily basis when weather conditions allow. Visual monitoring, continuous webcam coverage from multiple angles, including a summit-facing camera and lateral cameras covering the southeastern flank where the dome-fed lava flows have been most active. Tilt meters, measuring ground deformation near the summit. This network has been running continuously for 141 days. It has documented every significant dome event, every pyroclastic flow, every SO2 reading, every seismic swarm. And here is what it cannot see: the interior of the dome, the fracture network that is developing inside the dome's cooled crust as it cycles through growth and partial failure events. The temperature distribution within the dome, which sections are still hot, still mobile, still potentially explosive, versus which sections have cooled and solidified into relatively stable material. The pathway geometry between the actively extruding vent at the dome's base and the internal fractures that have developed over 141 days of cyclic growth. Those parameters, the ones that would tell PHIVOLCS the most about whether the current dome is approaching an internal failure mode, are not measurable from the surface. Thermal cameras can estimate surface temperatures, They cannot image the temperature 10 meters below the dome surface. Seismicity patterns can indicate general changes in dome behavior. They cannot map the specific fracture geometry inside the dome. The monitoring system sees the outside of a structure whose hazardous properties are a function of what is inside it. That is not a failure of the monitoring system. It is the fundamental limitation of remote sensing applied to a geological structure that is too hot, too unstable, and too active for direct instrumentation. PHIVOLCS watches the dome the way a doctor examines a patient through the skin. They can see a great deal. They cannot see everything. And after 141 days, the thing they cannot see has had 141 days to develop into whatever it is now. Here is the historical anchor that makes the 141-day record impossible to read as routine. On February 1st, 1814, Mayon produced the deadliest eruption in Philippine recorded history. 200 people killed, the town of Cagsawa buried. The church, whose tower still rises from the lahar deposits as the most photographed ruins in the Philippines. But the 1814 eruption did not begin on February 1st. It began weeks earlier. PHIVOLCS and volcanological historians have reconstructed the 1814 sequence from contemporary accounts, letters, parish records, colonial administrative documents, and the picture that emerges is of an eruption that underwent a prolonged growth phase before its catastrophic climax. Weeks of elevated activity, lava flowing on the flanks, the mountain building toward something, communities that had been watching and waiting and making calculations about when to leave, and then the paroxysm. The pyroclastic flows that traveled fast enough, far enough, to bury people who had not left. The 1814 sequence was not a sudden event. It was a culmination. The buildup was visible. The catastrophe was the endpoint of a process that had been developing for weeks. And here is the connection to the current 141-day record. The pre-paroxysmal phases of Mayon's most significant historical eruptions, 1814, 1984, 1993, 2006, are characterized by exactly the parameter combination that the current 141-day record shows. Extended dome growth, persistent elevated SO2, continued seismicity without sustained decline, rockfall-generated PDCs as the maturing dome sheds material regularly. Not every eruption that builds through this phase reaches a paroxysmal climax. Some decline, the dome deflates, the SO2 drops, the seismicity fades, the eruption ends. But the eruptions that did reach paroxysmal climax, the ones in the historical record that caused mass casualties, passed through this phase first. The 141-day record is not proof that a paroxysm is coming. It is a description of a system that is in the same phase those eruptions were in before their worst moments. Here is what officials are not framing clearly. The people most informed about the 141-day accumulation are not the international news audience that watched the fireball and moved on. They are the 84,000 people in Albay province who have been living with this eruption since it began. Some of them are in evacuation centers. Some have returned to the exclusion zone boundary. Some are inside it. Because 141 days of eruption produces the same economic calculus that every prolonged volcanic crisis produces. The cost of compliance eventually exceeds the cost of risk for some families. The people who live within sight of Mayon every day, who have watched the dome grow, who have seen the pyroclastic flows descend the southeastern flank on dozens of mornings over the past 141 days, understand viscerally what the daily bulletin represents. They do not read the data tables, they watch the mountain. And the mountain has been performing consistently for 141 days, consistently enough that the performance has become background. The danger of 141 days is not only geological, it is the normalization that 141 days produces in the people who are supposed to respond to its warning signals: alarm fatigue, bulletin fatigue, evacuation fatigue. The 141-day record is not just a story about what the volcano has done, it is a story about what 141 days of warning does to the people who receive it every morning. When the fireball crossed the sky, the world looked up. The people who had been watching for 141 days barely reacted, because they had been watching for 141 days, and nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet. Here is what the data shows when the 141 daily bulletins are read as a sequence rather than as individual reports. Across 141 days, PHIVOLCS has recorded thousands of volcanic earthquakes beneath the summit. The daily average has not trended to zero. It has remained above the pre-eruption baseline every single day of the eruption cycle. Tens of thousands of rockfall events across 141 days, each one representing a piece of the dome-shedding material down the flanks. The rockfall rate has not declined monotonically. It has fluctuated, with periods of acceleration corresponding to periods of higher extrusion rate, but never falling to the near-zero levels that would indicate the dome has stopped growing. Dozens of pyroclastic density currents have descended Mayon's flanks across 141 days. The maximum runout distances of those PDCs, plotted across the 141-day timeline, show a gradual extension. Week 1, PDCs to 1 to 2 kilometers. Month 2, PDCs to 2 to 3 kilometers. Month 4, PDCs to 3 to 4 kilometers. The flows are reaching further, not every day, not uniformly, but the trend line across 141 days, the line connecting the maximum runout events, points outward. Further down the slope, closer to the communities outside the exclusion zone, the total SO2 output across 141 days of eruption, calculated from the daily flux measurements, represents a significant sulfur dioxide burden to the atmosphere above Albay province. That cumulative gas output is not just an environmental statistic. It is a proxy for the total volume of magma that is degassed at or near the surface over 141 days. More SO2 over 141 days means more magma has been involved in the eruption than the individual daily readings suggest to a reader who sees only today's number. The cumulative picture is larger than any single day's data implies. There are 3 ways to read 141 days of continuous Mayon eruption with a growing dome and extending pyroclastic flows. Eruption cycles at Mayon typically last from weeks to months. 141 days represents the longer end of historical eruption durations in Mayon's documented record. Under this reading, the system is approaching the end of its current cycle. The magma batch that has been driving the eruption is being depleted. The SO2 persistence reflects ongoing but declining supply. The dome growth is slowing toward cessation as the extrusion rate decreases. The PDC runout extension reflects dome structural maturation. Larger collapses from a larger dome, not necessarily a more energetic system. The eruption will end, not in days. The current signal level does not indicate imminent cessation. But in the coming weeks, as the supply rate finally drops below the threshold for surface extrusion. This is the most conservative and most statistically probable interpretation. Its weakness, 141 days with no SO2 decline and extending PDC runout, does not match the late-stage signature in PHIVOLCS documentation of previous Mayon eruption endings. The endings tend to show declining SO2 weeks before dome extrusion ceases. The current data does not show that decline. The 141-day record reflects a magmatic system that has not exhausted its supply. The deep seismicity component, the low-frequency events that indicate fluid movement in the magmatic system, has remained present in the data throughout the eruption cycle, suggesting ongoing supply from depth. The dome has grown to a volume and structural complexity that creates the conditions for a significant collapse event, larger than any of the individual PDC events of the past 141 days. Under this reading, the eruption is not ending. It is in a mature phase, the phase that precedes Mayon's most hazardous events in the historical record. The question is not whether the eruption ends, it is whether it ends gradually, or with a paroxysmal episode that defines the eruption in the historical record the way the 1814 event defines that year. Under this reading, the 141-day eruption is not one event with a beginning and an end. It is the visible surface expression of a magmatic system that has been in continuous recharge and eruption mode, with the eruption surface expression driven by successive magma batches rather than a single depleting reservoir. If fresh material has been entering the shallow system while the eruption proceeds, if the low-frequency seismicity in the data reflects multiple recharge events rather than background noise, then the 141-day eruption is not approaching a conclusion defined by the depletion of a fixed initial magma volume. It is in a dynamic equilibrium, erupting at approximately the rate it is being supplied. Under this reading, the eruption does not end when the initial supply is exhausted. It ends when the supply rate from depth decreases below the extrusion threshold, and that timing is not determined by counting down from day 1 of the eruption. It is determined by the magmatic system at depth, which the monitoring data does not directly observe. Here is what PHIVOLCS knows. 141 days of eruption data, documented daily, published publicly. The dome is at its largest current cycle volume. PDC runout has extended. SO2 has not declined to baseline. Seismicity remains above pre-eruption background. Here is what PHIVOLCS cannot determine from current data. Whether the deep seismicity component in the data represents ongoing magma recharge or residual signal from the original magma batch as it completes its ascent. Whether the dome's internal fracture network, developed across 141 days of cyclic growth and partial collapse, has reached a configuration that predisposes it to a sudden large-scale failure event, or whether it is dispersing stress through the small daily rockfalls efficiently enough to prevent catastrophic failure. Whether the PDC runout extension trend visible across 141 days is approaching the 6-kilometer boundary of the permanent exclusion zone, or will arrest before reaching it. And the deepest unknown, the one that determines everything downstream of it. When did the eruption cross from early phase into the phase that precedes Mayon's paroxysmal events? Was it at day 60, day 90, day 120? Is it today? The 141-day record contains the answer, but the answer is only legible in retrospect, in the kind of pattern recognition that volcanologists apply after the eruption has ended, to the complete data set with the knowledge of how it concluded. Before it concludes, the 141 days are a sequence that could still resolve in either direction. PHIVOLCS is reading an incomplete sentence. The volcano has not yet supplied the punctuation. The fireball crossed Mayon in 2 seconds. It was beautiful. It was alarming to people who did not know what they were looking at. It was, geologically, completely irrelevant to the story of the volcano below it. Below it, 141 days of daily bulletins, 141 mornings of seismicity counts, 141 measurements of SO2 flux, 141 reports of rockfall events and pyroclastic flow runout and dome observation, a continuous record of a volcanic system doing what Mayon does, building, shedding, building again, across a span of time that has transformed the summit structure from bare rock to a complex, heavily fractured dome whose internal architecture is invisible to every instrument positioned around it. The fireball got 2 seconds of global attention. The 141 days got 141 paragraphs in daily bulletins that the global audience never read. But the 141 paragraphs contain the actual story, not the fireball. The dome that was there before the fireball crossed it. The dome that will be there tomorrow morning when the next bulletin is published, growing, shedding, cycling through fracture and partial failure and regrowth, at distances that have extended over 141 days, further than week 1, further than month 1, further than the exclusion zone was originally drawn to contain. The 84,000 people who have been watching this longer than the global audience has been watching anything. They are still watching. Not because they want to, because Mayon is there. Because it has been there for all of their lives, and all of their parents' lives, and all of the lives before those. Because the perfect cone that every photograph captures, symmetrical, precise, almost architectural, is perfect because it has rebuilt itself from every eruption, every paroxysm, every collapse. Because the symmetry is not the result of stillness. It is the result of continuous reconstruction, of 141-day cycles and longer ones, and the geological patience of a system that does not measure time in news cycles. The fireball crossed the sky in 2 seconds. Below it, the dome was on day 141 of becoming whatever it becomes next. The bulletins know, the cameras know, the seismographs know, and the mountain, in the way it always has, is deciding on its own schedule what the 142nd day looks like. The instruments will record it before we see it. The bulletin will describe it before we understand it. And the dome, still there, still growing, still shedding pieces of itself down the southeastern flank, will not have read either the bulletin or this script. It only knows what is inside it. And what is inside it has been building for 141 days.